So I'm here on the couch with John Bulmer. John, welcome to the Foundation.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about how you first got interested in photography. I mean, we're going to go right the way back to I don't know which decade even. But what was the first thing you saw that got you excited about photography?
Well, I remember I was fascinated as a sort of early teenager by all sorts of mechanical devices like Meccano and toy trains and building radio sets and carpentry. And then somebody gave me a box brownie once to play with. And I was first of all fascinated by the mechanical side and the business of developing and printing and how it all worked. And so I did quite a bit like that, and I built myself a sort of primitive darkroom with an enlarger made out of tin cans and Meccano and sort of dabbled away in a cupboard with chemicals. And then suddenly I discovered the image. It was, it sort of came upon me from this mechanical beginning in a way. And I saw things like the Book of the Family of Man exhibition, which had just come to England. And I saw, I think, one of Cartier-Bresson's books, and suddenly it made the whole thing really exciting.
So these early days, you were a teenager when you built your darkroom?
Yes.
Okay, so and then we're talking like 5 years later when you discovered. And then you started working regularly for the magazines. How did you get in on that scene?
Well, before that, I sort of... I did decide that I was going to go to university to study engineering. I was meant to be an engineer. And during my school holidays, I worked for the local freelance photographer in Hereford. And that was sort of exciting. I got sent out on assignments for the sort of Sunday People and all sorts of things, chasing a vicar who was living with his housekeeper, and all rather cloak and dagger, I think. But I did go up to Cambridge and straight away joined the university magazine Varsity. And I'm afraid I spent most of my time taking photographs and not very much studying engineering.
And tell us about Varsity. Was it a picture-led magazine, or did you just supply the photographs?
Varsity was a normal sort of newspaper, a weekly newspaper with quite a lot of pictures. And we had our own darkroom there, and we did news stories to do with the newspaper. Mm-hmm. But then I was also involved in a picture magazine called Image that a group of us started whilst we were there. And that had a couple of issues while I was still at Cambridge, and then it sort of eventually got lost. But it was a little adventure to try and make a picture magazine in England.
And were the pictures in Image magazine taken in Cambridge, or were they from wider afield?
It started in Cambridge, but they became wider in field. In fact, I did a story later on unemployment in Hartlepool for them, just because it seemed like it was something that needed to be done, and Image was an obvious outlet. And
that, I assume, inevitably led to working for the likes of the Sunday Times, well, first Town magazine, because you did a lot of work for them, didn't you?
Well, my career at Cambridge came to a rather sudden end, because I did a set of pictures on the night climbers of Cambridge. That's the students who climb up the buildings at night, with a journalist friend called Tim Green. And we sold the story to Life magazine, which was obviously great for my career, but it wasn't great for being at Cambridge, and they threw me out.
Really?
They didn't actually accuse me of it, but they said that they thought I would fail my finals. So I found myself on the street, 6 months or 3 months before my final exams. Mm-hmm. And I'd been sort of unofficially doing stories for the Daily Express while I was in Cambridge. And so I went up to see them and asked for a job. And to start with, they laughed at me, but it was the usual chaos that you get in a newspaper office. So they would start talking about something, then the telephone would ring, and then the other editor would say, "Oh, have a cup of tea, dear boy. Have a cup of tea, dear boy," and then something else would happen. And actually, I went back 3 days running, and on the third day, the picture editor leant over and said, "Oh, we're a bit short next week. Can you help us out for a couple of days?" So I did, and I was there for over a year as a news photographer.
And then how about moving on to Town magazine?
Well, whilst I was at the Express, I was working on a freelance basis, and I used to work a week on, a week off, effectively. So I had time to start building up other things, and that's when I started working for Town magazine.
And it's during those early days you made your first foray up to the north. Was that an idea that you initiated, or was it something that was commissioned?
No, it actually came from them. Town magazine was wonderful. They had a lovely art director called Tom Woolsey and a features editor David Hughes, who was became a very great friend. And they suggested this story, which was really comparing two towns, a boom town, Watford, which was doing very well, and a dying town, Nelson, in Lancashire, which was, they were scrapping all the mills. So it was really a comparison between the two towns, but Nelson was what really fascinated me.
And it's funny that, in fact, your first taste of the North led, in fact, indirectly throughout your career to a real association with you photographing the North.
I loved it, and I think that the people were so friendly, and they were touched that someone from the South should take the trouble to come up and see them, and almost nobody said they didn't want to be photographed, and it was really a very nice atmosphere. And also, I felt as a photographer, it was like a license to steal. Every street corner had something that was extraordinary and fresh for me, and I loved that a lot.
And did you feel in those days that the North was particularly underrepresented in terms of photography and magazine publishing?
Well, I don't. Maybe. Mostly, I just hadn't experienced it before, and to me, it was exotic in the way Darkest Africa is exotic. It was just images that I hadn't seen before, and I found them very, very exciting. And I was therefore quite pleased when I got more assignments to go back there.
And at the same time, people like Don McCullum were starting to work at Town magazine.
Yes.
Did you know each other? Were you a group? Did you hang out together?
Yes, I did quite a bit in those days. Don was, he did quite a lot on the East End of London, which was where he came from, obviously, but he also did some things in the North. And certainly Town magazine in those days, Terence Donovan did a lot of the fashion, and Don and I both did a lot of stories on photojournalism. So we were friends, and I didn't really feel competitive in a way. I felt, there was quite a difference between us, but we were good friends, yes.
And then in '63, along comes the Sunday Times magazine. And was it automatic almost for you and Don to start to work for them?
Well, Don didn't for some reason. I think he was working for the Observer newspaper, which kind of prohibited him from doing the Sunday Times as well. But certainly I was called in to see them, and it seemed like a very interesting project. So I did work from them right from the very first issue.
And when you went to these, because during that period you travelled the world for the Sunday Times, didn't you?
Yes, well, within a year of them starting, they'd sent me around the world, a couple of times. So it was.
And how did the ideas evolve? I mean, was it, were you sitting in on the conferences they had, or would they suddenly say, okay, John, can you go to Ethiopia next week?
Well, it varied. I mean, sometimes if I'd been working with a journalist, the journalist would have the idea, or we'd talk about it, and we'd go in and have a chat to them. So these things often evolved in sort of conferences, and not in a very formal way, but I think, I put up some ideas, and they put up some ideas, and the writers put up some ideas. So it was a mixture of all these things.
And I guess back in those days, you had a much more time to do these projects. It's not like today's editorial market, where if you get a project for 3 days, it's considered a lengthy assignment.
That's right. I mean, I think it was '65, the Sunday Times sent Richard West and I off to South America for 3 months. And we had a couple of stories we'd planned on. The main one about the struggle for power in Latin America, which turned into 2 whole issues. But we kept finding other stories and doing them, or cabling, because we didn't have you didn't have email in those days. We sent telegrams asking for more money, and usually it turned up in a bank somewhere. And they gave us an air travel card, so we could just go where we wanted. It was an incredible freedom that was wonderful.
And perhaps your most celebrated issue from the Sunday Times was the actual one, the special edition on the North. Was that something that you put to them because you'd accumulated a lot of pictures? And did it involve shooting new pictures for that particular issue?
Oh, it was totally new, because it was primarily in colour, and nobody had ever photographed the industrial north of England in colour before, not on a professional sense. And that did cause me quite a lot of heartache, because shooting colour was quite difficult in those days. The film was very slow, the latitude was poor, and I didn't think that photographing northern cobbled streets on a sunny day would get across the atmosphere. So I did make a decision that I wanted to do it in winter and try and shoot in rain and fog as much as I could, because I felt that would give a better atmosphere, but it was technically quite difficult to do.
And what cities or towns did you go to, and how long were you spending on that assignment?
Well, I can't really remember, but I probably spent about 3 weeks or something. I made, 2 or 3 trips, and a lot of the time I just drove around in my car and stopped when I saw something interesting. It wasn't sort of research led, really. I just followed my nose and stopped when I found things that looked interesting.
And after, I don't know, was it maybe 10 years, you then started to make documentary films. So what made you decide that you should go from being a still photographer, very successful at that, working probably for the most prestigious magazine in the UK, to becoming a film director?
Well, in the early 70s, the Sunday Times had a new editor called Hunter Davis. And he called me in and said, well, John, now there's a change of directions. We're looking for stories on crime, middle-class living and fashion. And I think what had happened was the advertisers were putting pressure on the magazine to make the editorial a little more compatible with their advertising for, grand living and motor cars and wines and food and things. So they didn't like the sort of things we were doing, particularly sort of Don McCullen's Biafra or Philip Jones Griffith's Vietnam, and they wanted the magazine to move into a more comfortable domestic scene. And I'd been travelling an awful lot around the world by then, and was sort of getting a little bit itchy to move on. I think I felt that I was going out and making the same compositions of people in different parts of the world, and I wasn't sure that it was really saying as much as I wanted. And the idea of involving film seemed attractive because you have a beginning, a middle and end, and also you're working with other people more, which is less lonely sort of operation. So I did decide I wanted to do that. It happened, I kind of fell into it fairly easily, because my friend from Town magazine, David Hughes, he was married to a Swedish film director, Maj Zetterling, and she asked me to shoot a film with her on Van Gogh, which we did in France with Michael Gough. And then around the same time, I was offered a visa to Burma, which no photographer had had for many years, not since the war. And I went to the Sunday Times and they said, oh, Burma, that's not very interesting really, let's not do that. So I toddled along to the BBC and I said, I've never made a film in my life before, but I've got this visa, will you give me some money? And they said yes. So those two things happened more or less at the same time, and that projected me into the world of film.
That's quite scary to not make a film and suddenly have the responsibility of a BBC commission.
In Burma, I had not shot a single foot of sync sound film in my life. I'd shot one little silent movie, and I found myself with the sound recordist in the middle of Rangoon. So it was quite a shock to the system.
And how many films did you make in your time at that particular phase of your career?
Well, I started off doing some camera work and some directing, because in those days to be a director cameraman the unions didn't allow it for commercial television, and the BBC didn't allow it because they had their sort of class system of the officers and the other ranks. So really the only way to be a director cameraman was to raise money independently, which was not easy. So I did a mixture in the 70s really of still photography, mostly for Geo magazine and American travel magazines, because I drifted away from the Sunday Times. And I also was making films, sometimes directing and sometimes as cameraman. And then really by the 80s and 90s I moved into making my own films for people like the BBC and National Geographic in the States and Discovery Channel. And it became a really wonderful time when I could travel all over the world and do my projects.
And during the 70s, the if you like, the independent photography movement in the UK started to emerge. We had photography galleries opening, the Impressions Photographers Gallery in London. How connected were you to that scene, or was that something that was out of your scope?
I kind of drifted away from it. I mean, I think a lot of the photographers I knew went off and did more corporate photography, company reports, which made them lots of money, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And I found advertising photography depressed me, and I didn't really like it. So that's why I wanted to be in films. And so I kind of moved away, and I wasn't written about by the photographers, writers and so on. I'd kind of drifted out of that scene completely, and it wasn't until I retired from making films and started to archive my old work that I felt I came back into the photography scene a bit.
So when did you start making films? What sort of year are we talking about?
71 was the first two with Van Gogh and the one on Burma. So really I was making films from 71 until about 2006, when I finally felt I had to retire from it.
Yeah. And it's in fact since then that you've now become celebrated within the world of photography. How does it feel suddenly, after all these years, to have the recognition for your contribution?
It's very nice of you to say that, but I don't know about that. But I think when I did retire from films, I knew that I had a lot of pictures sitting in boxes that I really wanted to go through and archive. So I started working my way through it, and I realised pretty quickly that the most interesting subject I had probably was the North. And although it was only, I think it was 8 assignments altogether, it did seem to me just enough of a package to make an interesting book, and I decided that I wanted to scan and archive all that material and start with the North. So when I got to the end of that, which probably took me about a year, I thought, well, let's get a publisher now, and jollily wrote off to a number, and nobody even replied. They didn't even send me rejection slips, most of them. So I was a bit shocked by that, because I knew that a book on the North had a following in a way, because a lot of people love the North, and rightly so. And then after about a year of that, suddenly I got an email out of the blue from Colin Wilkinson of Blue Coat Press, saying, could we do something together? And he was wonderful. He allowed me to do exactly what I wanted, which was just a simple, straightforward book on the North, which is really an expansion of those 8 assignments.
And now this book is in its 3rd edition, in fact. Isn't
That's
it? So
right,
it's been very successful. But also at the same time, there was an exhibition which produced a catalogue. Was that done at the same time as the North? I think it was the National Post Museum or something, or the National Coal Board Museum.
That was it was the National Coal Mining Museum in Wakefield, and they did a catalogue, which.
But was that initiated before?
That was before my book. Yes, that was the first thing, and it was quite a little catalogue, but it got a certain following, and I think it was a start anyway. But then also the other thing that changed was I did start getting a few exhibitions, like a big one in the City Art Gallery in Hereford, and that did get a lot of coverage on the net, which was a new thing. So that completely changed the way in which one could get known, of course. And so I think I began to build up a few followers in the North who loved their bit of the country and liked the pictures.
And I mean, when I look back on my own career, I moved to colour in the early 80s because one of the things I'd seen was the work coming from American photographers like William Eggleston, Stephen Shore. And on top of that, there was this very famous exhibition by someone called Peter Mitchell at the Impressions Gallery in 79, which has always been regarded as the first colour exhibition in a contemporary photography space. Were you aware of those sort of movements and those ideas within colour photography? Because you were a pioneer. But in fact, at the time,
I wasn't really, because when I moved off into film, I didn't really spend much time chasing what was going on in colour photography. But one thing that was interesting is I think in the late 80s, the Photographers Gallery did an exhibition on British magazine photography, and they picked, I think it was 6 or 8 people to give a chunk of wall space to each of them, and they included all the well-known names like Don McCullin, Philip Jones-Griffiths, Donovan, Duffy and Bailey, the fashion photographers as well. And out of those 8 or so people, I was the only one who put colour photographs on the wall. Everybody else still in those days felt that black and white photography was art and colour was a bit sort of commercial. It was something that you weren't quite proud of, but you did it because you had to.
Because they were all shooting colour for these magazines. They were told to, weren't they?
They had to, but they didn't feel it was sort of art in that way.
Mm-hmm. So do you think now, in this day and age, people have got over the whole colour thing?
Oh yes, completely. To me, I think there's still things that work in black and white, but otherwise I believe on the whole in using using what's available to you, and I think colour is a very interesting medium. But I think one interesting thing that happened is when the colour magazine started, there were no photographers in Britain who were used to using colour for photojournalism. It was used for fashion and advertising and travel, and people like Ernst Haast used it for rather wonderful abstract pictures of blurred yachts and all sorts, and bullfighting that was blurred, and there were lovely imaginary things, but straightforward photojournalism was not done in colour. And even Life magazine, well into the 70s, still did all their photojournalism in black and white, and they had a few essays in colour, but black and white was the way it was done. So that Sunday Times was quite unusual, and I think when they looked around in England and they started to see the photographers who'd worked on Picture Post, who were magazine photographers, they were not really comfortable in shooting colour. And I at the time remember thinking that a lot of them were going out and taking black and white pictures with colour film in their cameras. And the result was that images were too confused, there was too much in them. Mm-hmm. Because I think photography is really a form of abstraction. You're reducing this fussy world with lots of stuff in front of you into something that's simple enough to hit you in the gut and appeal to the senses that you want. And if you just take it in colour without regard, there are too many distractions very often, and you have to be much more careful to eliminate the extraneous in a colour picture.
And is that one reason why, for example, you prefer to shoot in winter rather than
to
get away from the bright
absolutely
colours?
And there are some pictures I did of miners and pit ponies where the whole of the background is taken away by the fog. Mm-hmm. And it simplifies the image, whereas otherwise you'd have too much there. And for example, if in a black and white picture there's someone in a red sweater in the background, you don't really notice, but in a colour picture it hits you in the eye, and you either need to make use of it or get rid of it. And so colour photography did seem more difficult in those days. Nowadays it's what you see and it seems totally normal, but it was just it was a different era.
And we're very happy that we've just acquired a set of prints from your project for the foundation. So in recent years, I assume part of this sort of being rediscovered is you get to sell prints as well.
Yes, well that's certainly nice. I mean my actual library, I have actually sold my archive to Popper Photo, but I have the rights for selling prints and for books and exhibitions during my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And the reason I did that was I looked around at quite a few photographers who'd given their archives to museums or academic institutions, and the people in charge of them didn't really know a good picture from a bad one. So the pictures all sat there and they were very well looked after in terms of being preserved at the right temperature and so on. But nobody ever looked at them. Whereas I felt that someone like Popper Photo, they're marketing the image. They spend a lot of time cataloguing them and putting them up on Getty Images so people will buy them. So I think in 100 years' time, there's a good chance that people will be seeing them. Whereas I think if they just sat in an archive, that there wouldn't be. And also I hated giving my daughter the job of throwing all these boxes of negatives away, which she couldn't do anything with. So I feel that they've gone to a better home.
Right, very good. Okay, well thank you very much, John. And it's been great to talk to you and great to have your images in the foundation.
Thank you.